AMD's new Radeon VII graphics card is finally here, coming in at $699 the same price you can get an RTX 2080 from Nvidia. So let's compare the two in a number of games at 4K, 1440p, and 1080p to see what the differences in performance are. For testing, I'm using the reference Radeon VII graphics card. Third-party cards may perform better. For the 2080, I've used MSI's Ventus, as that's what I happen to have available. And out of the box, it does have a higher boost clock than stock, but is otherwise a fairly mid-range 2080. The system that I'm testing with has an Intel i7-8700K CPU and an MSI Z390 Gaming Pro Carbon motherboard running at stock speeds, along with 16GB of T-Force Nighthawk CL16 memory running at DDR4 3200 in dual channel. Check the links in the description for details on all of the components as well as for up-to-date pricing. This same system was used to test both graphics cards, and I used DDU to clean the display drivers between testing. So with that in mind, let's get into the results. Battlefield 5 was tested in campaign mode with high settings rather than multiplayer, as I find it easier to reproduce the test run and it seems to be less CPU intensive. In this game, the Radeon VII appears to be winning. The average frame rates of both are extremely close together. However, the frame times are coming out ahead at 1440p and 4K resolutions, 14% and 20% better respectively, as shown by the 1% low results. Assassin's Creed Odyssey was tested with high settings using the built-in benchmark, and in this game, the 2080 was coming out ahead in all instances. At 1080p, the average frame rate of the 2080 was 36% ahead of the Radeon VII. However, at 4K, the difference lowers, with the 2080 now just 3% ahead. And the Radeon VII is actually 10% ahead and 1% low. Far Cry 5 was tested with the built-in benchmark at high settings, and at all resolutions, the 1% low from the 2080 was a fair bit ahead. However, the average frame rates were much closer together, with the Radeon VII actually slightly ahead at the 4K resolution. At 1080p, the 2080 was only 3% ahead for average FPS, 1% at 1440p, and then at 4K, the Radeon VII was 1% ahead. CSGO was tested using the Elliptical benchmark with all settings set to medium, and this game was consistently performing better with the Radeon VII in terms of average frame rates. The 2080 was scoring better 1% lows though. At 1080p, the Radeon VII was getting 17% higher average frame rates compared to the 2080, and a 5% improvement once we step up to 4K. Fortnite was tested using the replay feature with the same replay file, and at high settings, the 2080 was coming out ahead in all tests, both in regards to average frame rate and 1% low. At 1080p, we're looking at 15% higher average FPS with the 2080, a 24% improvement at 1440p, and then a 26% improvement at 4K. Overwatch was tested in the practice range with ultra settings, as this allows me to replicate the test accurately compared to playing with bots or other players. Again, the 2080 was coming out ahead in all tests, but realistically, these frame rates are very high and plenty for this game. At 1080p, the 2080 was 8% ahead in terms of average FPS, and then 15% ahead at both 1440p and 4K. Rainbow Six Siege was tested with the built-in benchmark at high settings, and in this game, the 1% lows from the Radeon VII were a fair bit lower compared to the 2080. The average frame rates were also down with the Radeon VII, though not as much compared to 1% low. At 1080p, the 2080 was 13% ahead in average FPS, 12% at 1440p, and 18% at 4K. Shadow of the Tomb Raider was tested using the built-in benchmark with high settings, and the results between the two were much closer together here, within a frame of each other at 1080p, and then the 2080 was 5% ahead at 1440p, and 3% ahead at 4K. PUBG was tested using the replay feature with the same replay file, and at high settings I was seeing slightly higher 1% lows from the Radeon VII at 1080p and 1440p, otherwise the 2080 was coming out ahead. At 1080p, the 2080 was getting 8% higher average FPS, a massive 26% higher at 1440p, and 27% at 4K. Watch Dogs 2 is a resource-intensive game, which I found to play well on both cards even at 4K with very high settings in use. I think it runs pretty well as long as you're getting a solid 30 FPS. The 1% lows in this game were a lot higher with the 2080 though, so much less dips in performance, especially at 4K where the 1% low from the 2080 is actually ahead of the Radeon VII's average frame rate. In terms of overall improvement, over all 10 of the games tested with a 1080p resolution, on average the RTX 2080 is performing 9% better than the Radeon VII. However, as we can see, it can vary quite wildly depending on the particular game, and this would probably differ even further with different settings in use. At 1440p, on average over the same games, the 2080 was now performing 10% better than the Radeon VII. But again, the results still vary quite a bit depending on the specific game being tested. At 4K, the 2080 was now 11% ahead of the 2080 in terms of average FPS in the 10 games tested, with the Radeon VII coming out ahead in 2 titles. It's possible that with all settings maxed out, the Radeon VII may have come out ahead more in 4K, or at least close the gap, as we might actually start seeing the 8GB of memory in the 2080 becoming more of a limiting factor. Unfortunately, I sent the 2080 back a few days before receiving the Radeon VII card, so I wasn't able to compare that. Because of that extra memory, I suspect the Radeon VII may be better in other compute tasks that can better utilize it. I've only tested gaming here. As for power differences, with the Heaven benchmark running, I found the test system with the Radeon VII graphics card installed to draw about 10% more power from the wall. Now for the final difference, the price. I suggest checking updated prices using the links in the description, as prices will change over time. As mentioned at the start of the video though, they're both around $700 US. However, my specific MSI Ventus 2080 does have an overclock out of the box, so it costs 10% more for the exact model that I tested with, which sounds reasonable given on average it was getting about 10% higher average frame rate with it compared to the Radeon VII card. Based on the performance difference, there is of course no reason to upgrade from one to the other, unless perhaps you really need the extra memory from the Radeon VII. If you're looking to buy today, which should you get? Honestly, based on these results, I'd be leaning towards the 2080. Even without my slightly overclocked out-of-the-box card, I've only seen small performance differences with graphics overclocks. I believe in most cases the 2080 would still be in front for a similar price. I've only tested games though. I'm suspecting that the Radeon VII may be more useful when it comes to compute tasks, especially things that can better utilize that 16GB of HBM2 memory. Either way, I think it's great to see a graphics card capable of 4K gaming with good settings from AMD. Let me know which card you'd pick down in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more comparisons and tech videos like this one.